HOA Karen tried to evict my boat, but I owned the lake and shut them down. Move that rusty piece of junk in 48 hours, or it's gone. HOA rules are not suggestions. I stared at the neon orange sticker slapped across my grandfather's fishing boat, the same boat he'd spent his final summers rocking gently on this very lake. My fists clenched around the brittle paper, heart pounding harder with every line I read. These people, these paper tyrants, thought they could steal my legacy? Little did they know. The lake wasn't theirs. It was mine. And I was about to remind them in a way they would never forget. Stick around, because what happens next might just restore your faith in karma. And if you've ever had a nightmare HOA story, you'll want to share it in the comments later. Trust me. It began with a sunrise like any other at Blue Creek Lake. The mist curled lazily over the water, dew glistened on the dock rails, and a lone hawk circled overhead. I brewed a strong pot of black coffee, the way my grandfather, Old Man Rivers, always did, and padded barefoot to the end of the dock. There she was, my little weathered fishing boat, scratches on the aluminum, paint peeling in corners. But every dent had a story. Every scuff was a memory. That's when I saw it. Neon, orange, tape, violation notice. Community Waters Regulation Breach. At first I thought it was a joke. Then I spotted the signature at the bottom. Karen, HOA Vice President. Have you ever had a moment where you go from peaceful to ready to throw hands in 3 seconds flat? If you have, drop by in the comments. I need to know I'm not the only one. I tore the notice off, read it once, twice, trying to process the gall of it all. They were threatening to fine me $500 a day if I didn't remove unauthorized watercraft from community waters. They even had the nerve to threaten towing at my own expense. Community waters? Towing my boat from my lake? I looked around. The dock? Mine. The shoreline? Mine. The lake itself? Owned outright by the Rivers family since 1951. My grandfather, God rest his stubborn soul, had fought tooth and nail to keep Blue Creek Lake private. He'd once faced down a mining company with nothing but a shotgun, a cigar, and a firm grip on the original land deed. Now, decades later, here comes Karen and her clipboard army trying to rewrite history with a few snippy emails and laminated notices. Not on my watch. Cue the dramatic montage. Me storming into the cabin, rifling through old filing cabinets, dust flying as I pulled out the original title deeds. Pages yellowed with age but rock solid in legal authority. Blue Creek Lake, private property. Water rights, inherited, unrestricted. Shoreline, 15-foot buffer zone included. I wasn't just ready to push back. I was ready for war. Before making any hasty moves, I called my neighbor Tommy Hall, an old-timer who'd lived down the shore for 50 years. He picked up on the first ring. "Tommy, you ever hear of this HOA nonsense?" "Son, those buzzards have been sniffing around ever since the condos went up 10 years ago," he drawled. "Figured they'd try to flex on you eventually." It turns out, while my family was away, building businesses, raising kids, bearing loved ones, the HOA had started treating Blue Creek like their personal fishing club, without ever owning a square inch of it. Has your HOA ever tried to take something they had no business touching? Tell me below. I guarantee you, you are not alone. I dug deeper that night. A quick online search revealed it all. Their elite anglers club proudly displayed photos of their fishing tournaments. Glossy shots of barbecues, inflatable piers built right on my shores, even event posters calling Blue Creek the community's crown jewel. Community's crown jewel? It was my family's legacy. And guess who organized all those events? Karen, always smiling smugly in the background of every photo, clipboard in hand, wearing designer fishing gear that had never once seen a fish. The anger bubbled in my chest, but something else stirred too. Resolve. If Karen and her cronies wanted a fight, they'd get one. Not just a skirmish, not just a slap on the wrist, a full-on legal and public relations takedown. The next morning, I called Laura Martin, the sharpest environmental attorney I knew. Her reaction? Wait. They want you to remove your boat from your lake? Cue a solid 30 seconds of unrestrained laughter on her end. And so it began. Legal letters were drafted. Cameras were installed. Documents were gathered. Allies were quietly recruited. Because I wasn't just fighting for my boat. I was fighting for everybody who's ever been bullied by an HOA drunk on its own fabricated power. If you've ever dreamed of watching an HOA get the karma it so richly deserves, keep watching. You're going to love what happens next. If you had asked me a month earlier what I'd be doing with my life, fighting a homeowners association over a lake my grandfather built with his bare hands, would not have cracked the top 1,000 answers. But life has a funny way of testing you exactly where you think you're strongest. As the morning sun painted the water gold, I found myself sitting cross-legged on the floor of the old cabin, papers spread around me like the battlefield maps of a general preparing for war. There they were. Deeds, surveys, maps yellowed with age but fierce in legal authority. Blue Creek Lake, owned in full by the Rivers family. Water rights, complete and unrestricted. The shoreline, a 15-foot protective buffer on all sides. It wasn't just paperwork. It was my family's blood, sweat, and stubbornness in ink and seal. My grandfather, Samuel Rivers, hadn't been a complicated man. He loved fishing, cheap cigars, and telling the mining companies that tried to buy him out to go pound sand. His philosophy was simple. Water belongs to life, not to suits. If that phrase resonates with you, smash that comment section below. Tell me, what piece of your childhood would you go to war to protect? Blue Creek wasn't just a lake. It was where I learned to skip stones, where my grandfather taught me to bait a hook, where we sat side by side in that same creaky fishing boat, sometimes talking, sometimes not needing words at all. I remembered the stories he told, voice low and serious. Dan, never let suits with shiny shoes tell you what's yours. They'll smile while picking your pockets. And now here I was, decades later, with a smiling HOA and their laminated notices trying to pick my pocket and steal a whole damn lake while they were at it. I spent the next few days preparing quietly. Laura Martin, my no-nonsense lawyer friend, was already gathering legal artillery. Tommy Hall, my neighbor, had become my unofficial spy, casually gathering gossip from the HOA Facebook group. And me? I bought 8 wireless security cameras. Yes, 8. Because if Karen and her fishing aristocracy thought they could trespass on my land under the cover of community tradition, I was about to make it the most well-documented tradition since Thanksgiving dinner. Quick poll. How many cameras do you think it takes to protect a lake from entitled HOA members? Guess in the comments. And no, the answer is never just one. As I screwed in the last camera on an old oak tree overlooking the east dock, I spotted it. A notice board, bright white, full of announcements. Elite Anglers Championship this Saturday. Annual barbecue, bring the family. VIP access for HOA members only. All plastered right there on the community events wall outside the HOA office. Only the community they spoke of? Yeah, it was my property. Every boat launch, every tent, every barbecue, trespassing. It was funny in a sad way. They'd built up years of tradition on someone else's land and never bothered to check the deed. Or maybe they had, and just figured no one would notice. Well, they noticed now. It happened 2 mornings later. I was enjoying a peaceful breakfast. Black coffee, eggs, bacon sizzling away, when there came a knock. A sharp, precise knock. The kind of knock that says, this isn't a social call, this is an ambush. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and opened the door. Standing there was Karen herself. She wore a lemon yellow blouse so bright it could cause temporary blindness and clutched a manila folder like it contained the nuclear launch codes. Good morning, Mr. Rivers, she said, voice tight and rehearsed. May I have a moment of your time regarding ongoing community standards, compliance issues? Translation. I'm about to try and push you around with meaningless rules I made up yesterday. Now, quick break. Have you ever had a HOA Karen show up on your doorstep looking like she's about to deliver a compliance violation? Because if you have, You know that folder is never good news. Tell me about it down below. Back to the showdown. I leaned casually against the doorframe. Sure, Karen, let's talk about standards. Whose standards are we talking about exactly? Her smile tightened. She handed me a fresh violation notice. It was printed on thick, expensive paper. You know, the kind you use when you're dead serious about passive aggression. It stated, unauthorized boat storage, community waters violation, visual inconsistency with neighborhood aesthetic. Fine, 750 hours. Boat subject to impound. I laughed, out loud, right in her face because I couldn't help it. Karen, I said, shaking my head, let me ask you one question. Who owns the lake? She blinked, a flicker of confusion. Then the mask slipped back on. The HOA manages the community resources collectively, according to established precedent. I cut her off. Who owns it, Karen? Name on the deed. Silence. Birds chirped in the trees. The lake lapped gently against the dock. Finally, she said, ownership is not the relevant consideration here. Management is. Wrong answer. Very, very wrong answer. Because while Karen was busy managing community waters, Laura was busy filing an emergency injunction in county court. And while Karen was handing out violations, my security cameras were capturing dozens of HOA members setting up barbecue tents, laying out tournament banners, launching boats, all on private property. By the end of that day, we had a digital treasure trove of trespassing evidence. That night, Tommy Hall came over, carrying two things: a six-pack of cold beer, a manila envelope stuffed full of HOA newsletters, emails, and event invitations going back 5 years, all bragging about their fishing tournaments on community lake property. We sat on my back porch, watching the stars come out, flipping through document after document. Tommy laughed so hard at some of Karen's self-congratulatory newsletters that he nearly dropped his beer. She even called herself the Queen of the Lake once, he said, wiping tears from his eyes. Can you believe that? Oh, I could believe it. And I was about to take back the kingdom. By the way, if you're still with me here, drop a emoji in the comments to let me know you're riding this boat till the bitter end. We're just getting started. The thing about fighting a well-organized group of paper tyrants is you can't just feel you're right. You have to prove it, beyond the shadow of a Karen's doubt. And so the gathering began. First step, fortify the defenses. Laura showed up that Saturday morning in her battered Subaru, wearing jeans, hiking boots, and an expression that could file a lawsuit all by itself. Let's make sure we leave no inch of this lake undocumented, she said, pulling out a tablet and a drone case. Yes, a drone. Because when you're going to battle against HOA Karen and her clipboard legion, you don't bring a knife. You bring air support. By noon, we had high-resolution drone footage mapping out every corner of the lake, photos of every unauthorized dock, tent, and barbecue pit, security camera footage catching HOA members setting up shop like they owned the place, screenshots of the HOA's own website, proudly displaying photos of past trespassing tournaments, copies of every Elite Anglers Club event invite mentioning exclusive lake access. It was, as Laura said, a slam-dunk package of evidence so heavy it needs its own gym membership. Meanwhile, Tommy was still our man on the inside. Every evening, he'd shuffle up my driveway carrying rumors from the HOA's group chats, flyers he grabbed from the community center, fresh gossip about how Karen was very confident that the boat problem would be handled soon. Spoiler alert, it wouldn't. That night, sitting around the kitchen table littered with documents, Laura laid it out clean. Daniel, here's the deal. You own the lake, full stop. The HOA has no legal claim, no easement, no jurisdiction. Them using your property without permission isn't a misunderstanding. It's textbook trespassing. And if they try to leverage the lake in any land deal, that's fraud, plain and simple. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling fan spinning lazily overhead. Somewhere I imagined my grandfather chuckling, lighting a cigar and saying, "Told you them fancy suits would come sniffing one day." By midnight, Laura had filed the preliminary paperwork. requesting a temporary injunction against the HOA's unauthorized use of the lake, assembling a case file that would make even the slickest HOA lawyer break into a cold sweat. It wasn't just about protecting a piece of property anymore. It was about sending a message to every petty tyrant who thought a laminated badge and a smug grin gave them dominion over someone else's life. Quick question, if you were in my shoes, would you play it slow and steady or go full scorched earth right now? Let me know below. I'm curious whose team diplomacy and whose team burn it down. By the time we finished, the plan was clear. 1. Let them go ahead with their grand fishing tournament. 2. Collect maximum evidence of trespassing. 3. Serve them cold justice, in court and in the court of public opinion. Because Karen and her elite anglers club had no idea they were building their empire on sand, and the tide was about to roll in. Tournament day dawned like something out of a Norman Rockwell painting. Blue skies, puffy clouds, birds singing, deer cautiously stepping through the woods. A perfect day to watch a group of self-satisfied suburbanites accidentally trespass themselves straight into a lawsuit. From my deck, binoculars in hand, I watched the invasion unfold. SUVs and pickup trucks rolling in like an invading army. Boats trailing behind them, glittering in the sun. Tents springing up along the eastern shore, my eastern shore. BBQ grills roaring to life, smoke curling into the perfect clear sky. There were easily 40 to 50 people setting up on my property. Some were already casting lines into the lake, beers in hand, congratulating each other on the great turnout. Eru, if only they knew. Laura arrived mid-morning, carrying 2 things. A thick folder labeled Evidence and a GoPro strapped to her chest, recording every glorious moment. "Smile, Karen," she muttered, adjusting the camera. "You're about to be famous." By noon, the main event kicked off. Henry Moore, president of the Elite Anglers Club, took the microphone at the makeshift stage and welcomed everyone. "Another beautiful day at our beloved Blue Creek Community Lake. Let's show those fish who's boss." Beloved Community Lake. Owned Community Lake. Small difference, legal difference, and a very expensive one. Then it happened. SUVs pulled up with a new group of sharply dressed strangers. Men in tailored suits, women in sleek pencil skirts, fancy leather portfolios in hand. The investors had arrived. Gregory Adams, the HOA president, was playing tour guide, leading them proudly along the shoreline, gesturing grandly at the community's future development. We eased closer through the woods, cameras recording. Overheard snatches of conversation. "Once the resort breaks ground here, property values will skyrocket. We already manage lake access, no legal hurdles remaining. The last holdout? Don't worry, we're negotiating with him." Laura grinned. "Negotiating, huh? Pretty sure ignoring certified mail and stealing boats isn't how negotiations work." The investors scribbled notes, nodded approvingly. Meanwhile, boats zipped around my lake. People barbecued, laughed, cheered. Every single minute, another nail in the coffin for Gregory and Karen's great scheme. Side note, if you're enjoying seeing these HOA tyrants dig their own graves, give me a big yes in the comments. Let's savor this together. We spent the next 3 hours gathering everything: photos, video, audio, witness testimonies from a few sympathetic residents who quietly slipped away from the crowd to join us. Because not everyone had drunk the HOA Kool-Aid. Some were just as furious as I was. Once they realized the lake they'd been told was community property had never been community property at all. As the sun began to dip toward the treetops, Laura checked her watch and nodded. "Showtime." We called the sheriff's department, showed them the injunction, showed them the deeds, showed them the drone footage. The deputy, a no-nonsense woman named Officer Rivera, shook her head in disbelief. "This is going to be one hell of a party to shut down," she said. Within minutes, Officer Rivera pulled up to the tournament grounds. She clicked her radio, stepped onto the main stage where Henry Moore was handing out trophies for the biggest base caught, and into the microphone she announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, I regret to inform you that you are trespassing on private property. You are hereby ordered to vacate immediately under court injunction. Failure to comply may result in arrest. The silence that followed was delicious. Mouths hung open, hot dogs slipped from stunned hands. Children stared wide-eyed at their parents. Gregory Adams went pale. Karen dropped her clipboard. Henry Moore sputtered something about misunderstandings and historic access rights. But no one was listening anymore. The empire had fallen. And there, in the soft golden light of sunset, Blue Creek Lake belonged, once again, to the Rivers family. If you've ever watched a house of cards fall, you know the first collapse is almost silent, a whisper of failure. Then comes the real noise, the gasps, the curses, the furious finger-pointing. That's exactly how it felt as Gregory Adams, Karen, and their cohort of HOA loyalists stumbled around in the rubble of their crumbling empire. The very next morning, the county courthouse buzzed with activity. Laura Martin, armed with a binder so thick it needed wheels, filed the full lawsuit: trespassing, unauthorized use of private property, intentional misrepresentation, and our personal favorite, attempted fraudulent conveyance. I showed up in court wearing jeans and my grandfather's old fishing hat, because sometimes symbolism is louder than any lawyer's closing argument. When the judge, a stern woman with steel gray hair and an intolerance for nonsense, asked Laura to present our case, she did it like a symphony. Drone footage looping on the courtroom monitors. Screenshots of HOA newsletters boasting about community lake management. Photos of unauthorized docks, tents, and barbecue pits. Emails from Gregory Adams and Karen promising exclusive lake access to investors. Gregory's lawyer squirmed in his seat. Karen wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. Henry Moore, the so-called president of the elite anglers club, didn't even show up, probably off trying to catch a fish he could actually land. The defense tried to argue historic community usage, that residents had been accessing the lake for years without issue, but the judge wasn't having it. Permission by omission is not the same as legal conveyance, she snapped, tapping her gavel. This is private property. There is no valid easement, no HOA agreement, no common use doctrine in play. Case closed on that matter. It was over before it even really began. The injunction became permanent. The HOA was barred from claiming any control over Blue Creek Lake. All events were immediately canceled. Access would now require written permission from the rightful owner, me. The judge also referred the matter to the county prosecutor for potential criminal investigation into fraud and financial mismanagement. Gregory Adams' face went sheet white at that. Karen clutched her bag like it could save her from drowning. 2 days later, it hit the local newspaper. The headline read, HOA leaders caught in unauthorized land scheme. Lake belonged to private owner all along. The fallout was swift and brutal. Residents demanded a forensic audit of the HOA finances. Gregory Adams resigned in disgrace. Karen tried to pivot, claiming she was just following orders. But emails recovered from HOA servers told another story. By the end of the month, both Gregory and Karen were facing civil suits from angry homeowners and possible criminal charges from the county. Funny how fast people stop believing in your community vision once they realize you built it on someone else's land. And as for the investors, they pulled out faster than a base spooked by an amateur fisherman. The resort project, dead in the water, literally. Blue Creek Lake was quiet again. Gone were the roaring barbecues, the thumping music, the shouted orders from self-important tournament marshals. All that remained was water lapping gently at the shore, birds wheeling overhead, and the scent of pine on the breeze, just like it had been in my grandfather's day. The community, shaken and humiliated by the exposure of the HOA's lies, began to change. At the next emergency meeting, the residents voted almost unanimously to dissolve the old HOA leadership and elect a new board. A retired judge named Michael Davis stepped up to lead, a man who valued property rights, transparency, and common sense more than newsletter aesthetics and fence height standards. I respected that. Michael and I sat down at the cabin one crisp morning, cups of coffee steaming between us. Daniel, he said, voice steady, we want to do right by this. No more pretending, no more shady deals. If you'd be willing, maybe we could work something out, a fair system. Residents can enjoy responsible, limited access to the lake without violating your ownership. I thought about it, long and hard. I thought about my grandfather, about the years of peaceful stewardship he'd given this place, about the way he'd let kids fish from his dock, provided they respected the water. And I realized, winning wasn't just about keeping others out. It was about building something better, stronger, than what the scammers had tried to create. And so we formed the Blue Creek Lake Conservation Trust. Access permits for residents, capped at a reasonable number. Funds directed strictly to conservation and maintenance. Strict no development policy to preserve the shoreline forever. Clear, honest boundaries about ownership and responsibility. The old signs came down. New signs went up, proudly declaring, Blue Creek Lake, privately owned, conservation in partnership with our community. Funny thing is, the lake looks healthier than it has in decades. The water is clearer. The fish are thriving. The invasive weeds, once trampling the shoreline, are almost gone. Because when you manage something with respect instead of greed, the difference is visible, palpable, alive. Karen, last I heard, she moved 3 towns over and tried to run for a different HOA board. Word on the street, she didn't even get past the first interview. Gregory Adams, facing lawsuits up to his eyeballs, probably wondering how a little fishing boat and a stubborn grandson sank his million-dollar dreams. As for me, I still take my grandfather's old boat out most mornings. The aluminum hull creaks, the oars groan, and the old patch seat threatens to split if I sit too hard. But it floats. It always floats. And as I glide across the misty water, the world silent and still, I feel it. The peace, the legacy, the unbroken chain stretching back through generations. Not everything worth fighting for is flashy. Sometimes it's a creaky boat on a quiet lake. And that, my friends, is victory. There's a certain kind of silence that comes after a long battle. It's not emptiness. It's not sadness. It's the silence of something made right again. As I sat on my boat in the middle of Blue Creek Lake, watching the sun melt into the water, I realized this fight was never just about a boat or a lake. It was about something bigger, something a lot of people forget. Until someone like Karen comes knocking. It was about ownership, about stewardship, about the basic right to say, this is mine, and you don't get to take it just because you want it. My grandfather understood that. He knew that places like this, wild, stubborn, alive, couldn't survive if left to the hands of people who saw them only as dollar signs and amenity upgrades. He fought to protect it from corporate developers once. Decades later, I fought to protect it from a different kind of predator, the ones who come smiling, quoting community standards, while sliding quiet knives into your back. Here's what I learned. Never assume good intentions just because someone uses polite language. Never let paperwork bullies shame you out of what's rightfully yours. And never, ever underestimate the power of one stubborn person armed with truth, patience, and a few well-placed cameras. Because when you stand your ground, when you refuse to be steamrolled by laminated lies and weaponized friendliness, you don't just protect what's yours. You protect the idea that people matter more than politics. That land matters more than spreadsheets. That honesty matters more than appearances. You protect a world worth leaving behind. Blue Creek Lake is safe now, not because of fences, not because of lawsuits, but because truth, when armed properly, always wins. Even against an HOA named Karen, especially against an HOA named Karen. If you enjoyed this story, if it reminded you of a fight you fought or a battle you wish someone had fought for you, drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your HOA horror stories, your small victories, and your hard-won lessons. Because here at HOA Karen Files, we don't just tell stories. We shine a light on every clipboard tyrant, every petty dictator, every community standards Karen who thinks rules matter more than rights. And we remind them, some of us read the fine print, some of us fight back, and some of us win. If you believe in that, Hit the like button, smash subscribe, and join the community that knows water is life, land is legacy, and freedom is worth the fight.